Good morning, everyone. Today we are reading Exodus 20 from 1 to 17. Then God spoke all these words. I am the Lord your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. You shall have no other gods before me. You shall not make for yourself an idol, whether in the form of anything that is in heaven above, or that is on the earth beneath, or that is in the water under the earth. You shall not bow down to them or serve them, for I, the Lord your God, and am jealous God, punishing children for the iniquity of parents to the third and the fourth generation of those who reject me, but showing a steadfast love to the thousandth generation of those who love me and keep my commandments. You shall not make wrongful use of the name of the Lord your God, for the Lord will not acquit anyone who misuses his name. Remember the Sabbath day and keep it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work. But the seventh day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. You shall not do any work. You, your son and your daughter, your male and female slave, your livestock, or the alien resident in your towns. For in 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth, the sea, and all that is in them, but rested the seventh day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and consecrated it. Honor your father and your mother, so that your days may be long in the land that the Lord your God is giving you. You shall not murder, you shall not commit adultery, you shall not steal, you shall not bear false witness against your neighbor. You shall not covet your neighbor's house, you shall not covet your neighbor's wife, male or female slave, ox, donkey, or anything that belongs to your neighbor.
Good morning, everyone. Hey, put up your hand if you've seen the movie Titanic. All right, good number of you. What's it like watching a movie where you know the ending of the story already? I still found myself, while that movie was on, when the iceberg was approaching the ship, I was actually going, miss the ship, miss the ship, miss the ship. I reckon what the journey we're on with our reading through the Bible, this big picture story of the Bible, it's not like the Titanic, because we're not trying to wish a change. Well, there might be parts as you go through the Bible that you wish there was better outcomes, but there's parts of it that you do not want to say, yes, Jesus, come down from the cross, come down from the cross, because it's part of the bigger picture. So for those joining us, visiting us today and joining in, we're in this series looking at God's big picture as over the whole of the Bible. And we've been in it for a number of weeks. And the purpose of our series is to get this big picture view, to get an understanding of how the whole Bible ties together. At its simplest, it's about God and God's relationship with people and creation, and it's also a book about God's character, his nature and desires and his intentions. And therefore, we're not actually just learning to do the series to learn about God or to understand about God, but it's actually more deeper. We want to be transformed by what we hear and understand. We want to have our faith deepened, and by doing so, strengthen ourselves in the way we live our lives. So I'm again going to encourage everybody as you're in this series that you actually come with that intent. I want at the end of this to feel that my faith is deepened and that I feel stronger about the conviction I have with my life. I actually reckon that should be our prayer. Lord God, reveal yourself to me more deeply and personally. Deepen my faith that I may live a stronger life. Yeah? But let's have a quick recap. So, Sean, if I can... right, okay. If you opened your Bibles, there's 66 individual books, and they're divided between two segments, the Old Testament and the New. You can have the next slide there, thanks. But if we were to put them into a bit of a timeline, they look something like this. They're not exactly like this, but there's something like this. And you'll see there's the beginning of God's kingdom, creation and people and sin, and that's kind of where we've been recently journeying with Genesis. Later on, like next week, we're going to see this and sort of move into this next section, the arrival of king and country. We're actually going to start exploring the themes of how kingship becomes big inside the Bible and how place, the land, is big within the themes of the Bible. Then we're going to move to what I've called the arrival of voices of warning, which leads to displacement from the country. That happens in the following week. Then we'll see and we'll move to the arrival of Jesus and the Gospels. And then we'll see the next section, which is around the consequence of living a life. Jesus has arrived, but there's a consequence of that. And that's what the Acts of the Apostles and the epistle letters, the different letters that are written by the different apostles have. And then the last book of all, Revelation. What does the future of God's kingdom look like? That song we sang, Salvation belongs to our God. And I just wish I could think of the words now, but wisdom and thanks, power and glory. That's Revelation 7. It's straight out of Revelation 7. We're singing words that sound good, but have actually come straight out of Scripture. Okay, next slide, thanks. We started at the beginning with Genesis, with the first book. And in terms of the big picture, we saw that we had one creator God, pre-existed all of creation, and as a creator had an intention for creation to live in perfect relation with each other, humans, God, and creation. Everything was meant to be in harmony. And we also learnt that within creation, humans, people, had a unique place. We're made in the image of God to be in perfect relationship with God and actually bring God's blessing and rule to each other and to creation. However, we move from, that was Genesis 1 and 2. Chapter 3, however, it doesn't last long. And we have the big theme of chapter 3, which is called often called the fall, is that within ourselves, within our humanness, the fact that we're made in the image of God is also the potential to dismiss, to disobey, disregard God. And when that happens, and it does, look around the world, we see there's consequences. And the consequences and the big theme was that there's death, both physical death and spiritual death. That led to last week, and the big theme from last week was that God, out of his great love for all of creation, was never going to allow this broken relationship to continue, but would work to restore the relationship by bringing into the world a group of people that would model what living in God's kingdom could look like. And that group of people began with Abraham. What's helpful to remember here is that God is bringing about a new perfect relationship, a new perfect creation, which is going to include all people by God himself becoming human and present. This theme of God being in the world. God's just not up there looking down. The whole Bible is this unfolding story about how God makes him, and we use this big word, incarnate, present amongst creation people. And that's a really big theme. The interesting thing, though, if you're looking at the Bible and the way this story unfolds, that plan of God's was a mystery. It was hidden. Apostle Paul in Ephesians actually says to the people, to the Ephesian church, this mystery that God had, that God was going to be incarnate present, was hidden, but now has occurred. What we have the advantage, getting back to the Titanic bit, is that we know there's this Jesus is there, and we're actually looking back at this, what is sometimes this hidden story, but actually it's unfolding. Next slide, thanks. This week, we're going to finish Genesis. We're going to somehow cover Exodus and Leviticus in one day. And we're going to see how God continues to work through people and some new big themes start to emerge. One of those big themes that emerges is this idea that from Abraham, who a promise of blessing was made, actually grows into a nation. What starts as an individual becomes a nation. Two, that despite the flawed decisions of individuals and groups of people, God continues to keep his promise to bless. Then third, that whenever God's people are threatened, God brings salvation. In other words, God comes to the rescue. Whenever the people are threatened, God's there. That God in his love is going to guide this nation of people how to live in relationship with him by giving them the law. And obviously in our Bible reading, 10 Commandments, and we'll come back to that in a minute. And finally, God in his love shows how this nation of people can receive restoration of relationship through sacrifice. It's really interesting. We just had communion, which, as Tony alluded to, one of the purposes of communion is that we think about what Christ's sacrifice on the cross. This idea of sacrifice, which actually for us is very, very, in our modern world, sacrifice is a very strange concept. We don't like sacrifice, you know. And if we're talking about people's sacrifice, we go to like Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom, and we go, no, we don't like that. But that's actually, this idea of sacrifice is actually unfolding through the whole of the Bible, and that's what we start to talk about today. So these five big themes come out of this Exodus, finishing of Genesis into Exodus and Leviticus. So I'm just saying, hey, this is where we're going. Okay, let's get down to it. Okay, next slide, thanks, mate. We're in Genesis. Abraham's been given the nod by God. And what we see and what we learn is that God creates a nation out of this one, creates from this one person a nation. And these people are to be people of God's kingdom. And the point to remember is that God's promise to Abraham to make a great nation was just that God was going to make a great nation, not Abraham. Which should have been pretty obvious, because since he was 90 years old and Sarah was 80 when that promise was made, it was pretty obvious that God had to do something, had to work a miracle. So Abraham gets a promise from God that he's going to have his own future and son. But he gets impatient. because it takes 10 years to fulfill. And in that 10 years, though, he gets impatient and he takes matters in his own hands and he sleeps with Hagar, who is Sarah, his wife's handmaid. And she gets pregnant and she gives birth to Ishmael. Then later on, obviously, Sarah does have a birth and gives birth to Isaac. Just a word of note here. Don't be misled by the strike through of Ishmael, as though he got chopped off, no blessing. God's blessing to Abraham was to bless all nations through Abraham. And a big theme that we sometimes miss, particularly in Christian world, is when we look at this idea of there's just one nation that's being blessed, this development of the Israelite nation. Every offshoot has its own blessed story. Ishmael becomes a blessed nation, and later on Esau does too. Because Ishmael, it's not that God felt sorry for Ishmael, it's because God said he would bless through Abraham. And so we have this promise going. So, moving along, we get Isaac ends up marrying Rebekah, and they have two sons, Esau and Jacob. Esau's the oldest. He should be the one who gets the big nod. He's the one who should carry forward the blessing. However, he gets cheated out of it by his scheming brother Jacob. But despite that, Esau also, if you read the Bible, you'll see Esau is very much blessed as well. And another big theme emerges, that despite the flawed behaviour of people and the decisions they make, God continues to bless. His plan is not thwarted by the bad decisions of people. I think that's a message for us as well. How often do we get caught up in our guilt about our bad decisions? God's plans for your life doesn't get thwarted by your bad decisions. Message for another day though. God remains sovereign. God reiterates his original promises to Abraham, to Jacob, just as he had done to Isaac before him. The interesting thing about Jacob is he's no means a perfect character. He ends up with 2 wives, 2 concubines, and 12 sons, and of which Joseph becomes the next principal character for the rest of Genesis. But we need to have a notable mention for one of his other brothers, a guy called Judah. Why? Because later on, the message of the Messiah is going to come from the line of Judah. What we can see now is that what started as an individual, Abraham, has grown now into an extended family. It's quite big, it's growing. And with family life comes all the problems of jealousy and conflict, which results in Joseph being sold by his brothers into slavery into Egypt. The short version is that despite the flawed decisions of people, God recreates and transforms Joseph's situation as an imprisoned slave. That's where he is. He's a slave, and he's worse, he's imprisoned. God raises him up to eventually be second only to Pharaoh himself, governing all of Egypt. When the lives of the other 11 brothers back in Canaan comes under threat because of famine, they hear that everything's going sweet in Egypt, and off they trot to Egypt. And we end up have this amazing story of a reconciliation, how Joseph meets these brothers who sold him off and he forgives them. But the whole point is that this extended family of God is now out of the land that God had took them to, and they're in Egypt. But they're under the rule and good blessing of God through Joseph. God's blessing is now running right out through Egypt and to all these neighbouring places that are facing famine. That's where the book of Genesis ends. We start the book of Exodus. And a lot can happen in 400 years. Literally, there's a 400-year gap. And this is where Exodus begins. This extended family of Abraham has continued to prosper and flourish and grow, and they've turned into a small nation. They're their own ethnic group within this community that's part of Egypt. And at that time, Egypt was the big show in town. All these multicultural mixes would have been there, but there was this descendants of Abraham. They've grown that big, though, that the Pharaoh of this time, 400 years later, who doesn't remember Joseph and what's gone before, is threatened by the very size of this minority, this ethnic minority. So he enslaves them, sets them to work to build and construct the cities of Egypt, the great pyramids and all the rest of the majesty of that time. The interesting thing is, the more he enslaves, the more he hardens, the more God prospers and they grow, the people. Eventually, Pharaoh sets about a genocidal path of killing all the male boys. And at this point, when the very existence of this new nation is under threat, God comes to rescue once again, but this time through the emergence of a character called Moses. Moses, who was himself saved from the infanticide that was happening at that time by God's miraculous hand, gets put into the little weaving basket, tar-covered weaving basket, floated down the Nile River, and gets picked up by no other than the princess of Egypt, and is raised as an Egyptian aristocrat. However, in a total reversal of the Joseph story, he falls out of favour with Pharaoh. And when he kills an Egyptian and has to flee to Midian, and miles away from Egypt. And another 40 years, that would have made him really old, another 40 years pass when one day God appears to Moses and tells him to return to Egypt from a burning bush. What follows then is a series of confrontations between God and Pharaoh. But God, through the agency of Moses. Moses is acting for God. And after these confrontations, God sees the release of people. We'll come to that. But the point is, Moses doesn't save the people. God saves the people. Remember what we said, one of the big themes is that despite the flaws and decisions of people, God continues to bless. Whenever the threat to the nation is there, God comes and saves. That's what's playing out here. The Pharaoh, after the 10 plagues, temporarily capitulates and he releases the small nation and says, off you go. Only to change his mind and pursue them with the army. And now this nation of people are trapped between the revenging army of Egypt and the Red Sea. Nowhere to go, what to do. I'm just picking up my place. And once again, God saves his people by miraculously parting the waters of the Red Sea and allowing the Israelites to escape to the other side. And then collapsing the water back over wipes out the Egyptian army. This is another of those milestone moments in the storyline, this big picture of the Bible that will repeat itself over and again. God conquers over evil and suffering. Just as Moses stood as an agent of God before the power, what was kind of like the evil powers of Egypt there, move forward, and Jesus, as God, stands before Pilate, as the representative of Rome. And to do what? To save the people. This is this theme that's playing out again, what Jesus was doing again. Back to Moses. Moses leads now what is now a nation of people. But think about it. These people have lived for 400 years as they've been growing as an ethnic group in Egypt under the influence of an Egyptian culture. Egyptian gods, they were polytheists, lots of gods. And God needs to shape the identity and reset the identity of these people. How are these people going to be his blessing and rule on earth? They have to be retaught what's to happen. So God introduces them to rules and laws that are going to characterize and guide their way of life and identity. The 10 Commandments that we had as our Bible reading is kind of seen as this is the big beginning. The big beginning. The first 3 laws, that's why I had them on separate slides. The first 3 laws actually defined the relationship they were to have with God. You are to have no other gods but me. I'm the one. You're not allowed to have idols. What are these idols? Won't care. They're not allowed to be images of anything on heaven and earth. There's me. And you're not allowed to use my name in vain or use my name falsely because I'm the creator God of everything. This is the relationship you've got to have with me. And then the next 7 are all about how you are meant to be relating to one another. Thou shalt not kill, thou shalt not steal, thou shalt not covet. He was resetting how this perfect relationship between God and each other was meant to look like. And he had to do it through rules and commandments in order to create a new identity. The other big theme that manifests itself at the same time is the way that God is going to be present with the people. And this is where you have to kind of connect. You're always thinking backwards. In Genesis, at the very beginning, God walked through the place, through the Garden of Eden with Adam and Eve, and it was like he was there, one-on-one. But after all this time, there's been this separation of God, and how is God going to be now present with this new people? So not since the Garden of Eden has God been present in a physical manner with the people. So much so that when God says to Moses, go to Egypt and tell Pharaoh and the people that I want to let you go, Moses turned around and rightly says, well, what's your name? Like, what do I tell them? And we get that famous part where God says, I am who I am. Or another translation is, I will be what I will be. But the big thing to remember with that is the I am who I am. Fast forward all the way to Jesus and the Gospel of John, and Jesus starts saying to people, I am. I am the good shepherd. But it's this tag. It's suddenly Jesus is the people at Jesus' time were hearing the echoes of the same thing. God saying, I am, and as being God, and Jesus saying, I am. So this is where those things are connecting. In Exodus, we see that God makes himself physically present to the nation. And he does it during those 40 years of wandering through the desert. He was a flame by night and a cloud by day. Later on, God instructs Moses to build a tent, but not any old tent, a tent where God would be present, physically present. And you'll read in Exodus how God descends onto what becomes the tabernacle, this tent, where Moses went to meet with God. He was physically present. In the future books of the Bible, we'll see how the tent, which becomes this tabernacle, ends up being built into a temple later on by Solomon. And that temple becomes the place where God is with his people. That shouldn't be too foreign for us. Temples have been, for thousands of years, that symbolic place where the God resides with their people. And it's been across different cultures and different people through humanity. God exists physically somewhere with his people. Again, moving forward in time, things are going to change with the coming of Jesus, and we have the Apostle Paul writing in Romans says, you believers, you are now the temple. God's incarnate presence is no longer in a building, it's in you. You are the incarnate presence of Jesus and God to rule and bless the world. But this is what it's looking back to. This idea of a God is always wanting to be present with his people. Finally, we get to the last big theme. If God is going to live with his people, it kind of creates an issue. What happens when the people break the law, this moral code that's been given to them? What happens? How can you live with the holy God when you're a not so holy people? And so God creates a whole lot, and this comes out of the book of Leviticus. We've kind of skipped into Leviticus now. There's a whole lot of sacrificial laws, instructions to priests, instructions to the gathered people on how their sins, their wrongdoings can be forgiven through the sacrifice of an animal. And we go right, and this idea of sacrificing animals is for us, again, another one of those, 21st century, man, not sure, what's this all about? Very cruel to an animal. But back then, animal sacrifice was a very normal kind of way of trying to connect with God. So God says, He creates this theme, this idea that sacrifice, which is about death, the humans can change. These animals can step into our place. It actually started early. If you remember last week, Rod talked about how God asked Abraham to sacrifice Isaac, his one son. And at the point of maybe killing Isaac, God says, stop. There's a ram sitting, and the ram becomes the sacrifice. In the story of Exodus, in the 10 plagues, the final plague, where God is going to go through and kill all the firstborn. Something that we sit there and go, oh my God, how does a loving God do that? Great question. Which I'm not going to, which I can't give you an easy answer for, but we will actually address the idea of God and judgment in a future series. But God says to the people, kill a lamb and splatter the blood over the lintel, and as my spirit moves through, you will not experience death. The lamb has taken that space. So this whole theme of sacrifice starts to build. It's building all the time. And it'll develop and it expands as we go through the Bible. It's part of the big picture. And it's something that we, in our world, have to wrestle with. As we move through the rest of the Bible, the significance of the temple and sacrifices for the forgiveness of sins and for the offering of praise and thanksgiving is going to get developed further and further, and it'll become central to the faith practices of the Jewish people. It's really central. That it becomes the dominant aspect of their faith. We'll see that in the future weeks. Next week, we're going to move, and if I have the slide, thanks, Sean. Next week, we're going to move along our timeline, and we're going to look at the two new themes of king and country. What happens as the people come to the promised land? What's this whole thing about land so important? Think of what's happening in Gaza today, and part of that story is mixed up here. It's thousands of years old. Also, what happens when a nation decides we need a king? Everyone else has got a king. We need a king. And so this whole developing understanding of a need for a king. Again, we have to think. Sorry, not we have to think. When we think of Jesus and Jesus being the king and standing before Pilate, and Pilate says, "Are you the king of the Jews?" And Jesus says, "It's you that says it." This is that whole kingship thing playing back all the way back to now. So I'm just building this idea of, as we look and as we grow, as we think through this understanding of the Bible, there's these big themes that are coming out. Now we're going to be talking about king and country. How are you going? There's a lot there. I'm finishing there. But But I thought today, has anybody got a question or a comment that they're pondering and just need to go, I don't mean to put anyone on the spot, but is there any?
Well, I just got lost on the sacrificial thing. Sorry, I just got lost on the...
Hang on, one, two, three.
I just got lost on the sacrificial part because I thought, I had in my mind that the very first sacrifices that God brought in were based on the Egyptians already making sacrifices. So I thought it was already based on an understanding of sacrifice.
Yeah, if I'm understanding your question, it's true. Sacrifice was a normal practice. It was practice that was done by other communities and cultures. The Baals and the cultures that predated even the beginning of Abraham, sacrifice was a very normal practice. That's kind of, it's one of the ways we, yeah, no, it's very much so. So that's one of the ways why I was thinking about this morning. We tend to, we just got to keep reminding ourselves that when we interpret the scriptures and the Bible today, we interpret it through our 21st century minds and understanding and judgment and sensitivities and all those things. Whereas what we're reading about comes from another time, another culture, and another place. And sometimes when we're sitting there and we're saying, God, how can you allow such things to be? That was the story. That was how to create the move God's plan along with that community at that time. I'm not sure. Anyone else? Ron.
When Moses skipped out of Egypt, he stayed with a priest of Midian.
Midian, yep.
A priest of what?
Great question. The priest of Midian, or Jethro, became his father-in-law. Yeah. Priests have always been seen as the intermediary person between a faith community and God. So, like I'm talking about in generalized terms. And the Midian was actually, I'll be corrected. I can't tell you whether it's off Esau or off Ishmael. It's probably off Esau.
It's off Abraham remarried after Sarah died, had another 6
Sons. One of them, Midian. Okay, so we have this idea that it's extended out. But that group of people have had their own faith, understandings of God, and he was seen as a priest of that. Yep. Okay, let's end. It's 10 past 11. Thank you for sitting through what is like a whole lot of stuff. I hope it's helpful that I keep wanting to go back, revise and back and because we've got this big building picture. Let me pray. Loving God, as we continue to work through this series, your big picture of the Bible, I just come back to that original prayer, Lord, that we maybe get new revelation of understanding. We might learn new knowledge, Lord. But most important, Lord, help transform that into a deeper faith. Lord, help us to see the connections of our faith, our belief in Jesus, what Jesus did, who Jesus was, what Jesus is today. Lord, help us see how you had that building and help it strengthen our lives. Lord, I said before that we today are your presence on earth. Lord, teach us how to be the releases of your blessing and rule into the neighbourhoods in which we live, the people with which we work, the families to which we belong. Lord, help us be your people. Strengthen our lives and deepen our faith, we ask. Amen.